Okay, in this segment, we're going to do two things. First, we're going to talk about Parfit's consequence that Parfit thinks his theory has, and I want you to really think about this consequence and see what you make of it. And second, we're going to introduce an alternative way to think about the initial puzzle involving brown, red, and purple, and see what you make of. You can think about what you make of that. So let's start with this consequence of Parfit's theory. There are a couple of interesting consequences he discusses. We're just going to look at one. So he says you should not fear your distant death. You shouldn't regret that so much of your life should have gone by. These are not, he thinks, wholly natural or instinctive fears. They are strengthened by beliefs about personal identity which he's attacked. If we give up these beliefs, then your fear of distant death should be weakened. So he thinks if you can just get in the headspace that he's in, just think about personal identity in the right way, the way that he does, you won't worry about your distant death. Why is that? And I want you to think about this for a second. Why would adopting his theory mean that fearing distant death wouldn't make any sense? If you think about it carefully, you can come up with the answer. So maybe you want to pause here and think about it for a while, but I'll just continue now and tell you. Basically, the idea is this. You survive as some future person to the extent that you are psychologically connected. Psychological connection is a matter of similarity. Well, it's pretty obvious that in the distant future, the person inhabiting the body that you presently inhabit will be psychologically quite a bit different from you, and that there will be other, much younger, healthier people who are psychologically very similar to the current you. Why is that? Well, let me just use my own case here. I'm 45 years old. Let's say I manage to live to 105. That's, of course, hopeful, but let's just say I managed to live to 105. But right now, I have certain psychological features. By the time I'm 105, I won't have many of those psychological features. Right now, I have certain physical features, and by the time I'm 105, I won't have many of those physical features. Obviously, I'll change quite a bit in the next 60 years. Now, when I hit 105, I'm totally describing this in an illicit way. When the person who inhabits this body, let's put it this way, when this body hits 105, here's a legitimate question. Given the psychological differences between me and the person who inhabits this body at 105, am I that person? Well, remember, Parfit says it depends on which psychological features I think are most important. Maybe that 105-year-old will have some mental dispositions that are similar to mine, have some memories that are similar to mine, and so on and so forth. But a lot of the beliefs and desires will be very different, different enough that there will be reasonable points of view from which that's not me. The person inhabiting that 105-year-old body isn't me. Well, at that time, 60 years hence, there's going to be some other 45-year-old who's very much like me in many, many ways. And because of that, it will be perfectly reasonable for me to identify Stephen Biggs with that 45-year-old who's very similar to this 45-year-old, rather than to identify Stephen Biggs with that 105-year-old. So when that person inhabiting that 105-year-old body dies, or when that 105-year-old body doesn't work anymore, and the psychology associated with it goes away, there will be a reasonable perspective from which that is not the death of me, Stephen Biggs, sitting here right now in 2020. That will be the death of a different individual. And in 2020, when that different individual dies, there will be some other 45-year-old alive then. In 2080 rather, that when that 105-year-old dies, there will be some different individual, 45-year-old individual alive then who's very similar to me. And me right now thinking about that future should say, oh, I don't die. That 45-year-old is the one who is me, and that 45-year-old has, plenty of time to look forward to. So, thinks Parfit, when you adopt his view, you won't fear your distant death. I actually have a colleague who agrees that this bit of what you might call philosophical therapy got rid of his fear of death. Now, here's Parfit continuing, explaining how important he thinks it is to adopt his view. He says, these emotions, these concerns about death are bad, and if we weaken them, we gain. But we can achieve this gain without, say, also weakening, or can we achieve this gain without, say, also weakening loyalty to or love of other particular selves? As Hume warned, the refined reflections which philosophers suggest cannot diminish, are vicious passions without diminishing, such as are virtuous. There are, applicable to all our affections. In vain do we hope to direct their influence only to one side. So what Parfit's saying here is this, that if we really do adopt his view, and that allows us to get rid of our fear of distant death, it may also affect the way we think about other people and we think about the relationship between the person who started the semester and the person who's here now. And thinking about that relationship in a new way may have certain costs. And Parfit says, yeah, that might be right. There may be certain costs, but he thinks his view is true, and by and large, adopting the true view will have sort of good moral effects, and adopting the bad view, or practical effects, and the letting the false views go will have positive effects. Anyway, we're going to stop there. I said we'd explore something else in this segment, but I'll actually leave that for one final segment. So just in quick summary, you have Thompson arguing for body theory. She says, look, if you have this fission case where brown splits into purple and red, and you say you survive, if your mind survives, then you have to say, since brown's mind survives in purple, brown and purple are identical. Since brown's mind survives in red, brown and red are identical. And that commits you to saying that purple and red are identical. But of course, purple and red are not identical. They're distinct individuals. Therefore, the theory that led you into this trouble, mind theory, must be false. Parfit aims to reply to this objection. How does he reply? He replies by giving up on the identity all the way around. He agrees that purple and red are not identical, but he also thinks that purple and brown are not identical, and that red and brown are not identical. Nonetheless, he thinks purple is a survivor of brown and red is a survivor of brown. And this shows that survival doesn't require identity. And once we realize that survival doesn't require identity, we can accept that it's a matter of degree. The question then becomes what's relevant for survival, and his answer is psychological similarity, psychological connectedness. Psychological connectedness, of course, like all similarity relations, there's going to be ways in which two things are similar and ways in which they're different. And then the question becomes which kinds of similarity, which dimensions of similarity matter and which don't. And Parfit says that's all up to you. It's all up to what you consider to be important. There can be different reasonable assessments of what's important. And this gives us sort of his full-blown theory, which he thinks once you adopt, you'll realize you shouldn't fear your distant death. Okay, so that will end Parfit's theory, and next time we're going to look at an alternative response to that puzzle.